Hello, everybody, and a really warm welcome to this event in Berwick's 8th Literary Festival. I hope you've been able to perhaps enjoy some of the other events that have happened so far. I'm sure you're looking ahead to ones that are coming later on today and later in the festival. But of course, today's event promises to be outstanding. My name's Nolan Dalrymple. I'm a member of the steering group for the festival and a trustee of the festival. A couple of points to mention to you about how things work. There's a slightly different system this year as compared to last year in terms of the way that you can ask questions. And we really do encourage you to ask questions of Tim. You can do that, in fact, during Tim's presentation. So if your question comes up to you, you can pop it on during that. And indeed, you can do it during the question and answer session. If you hover your cursor around near the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see there's a little tab that says Q&A. And that's the place to do that. You just click on that. It's a little like the chat function. You click on that, and you can type a question into there. That will come through, and myself and Tim can have a look at that and can answer it for you. Tim is, of course, a distinguished speaker. We're really thrilled to have him back here in Berwick. He's a multi-award winning documentary filmmaker, investigative journalist, and of course, important to us today, best-selling author. He has written for national newspapers. He's made more than 80 documentaries for British and international broadcasters and has 17 published non-fiction books, including a couple of highlights: Hitler's Forgotten Children, Hitler's British Traitors, called a brilliant book by Dan Snow, no less, and the book that we're here to talk about today, which is The Spy Who Was Left Out in the Cold. Okay, The Spy Who Was Left Out in the Cold. And you get a sense there that Tim is very interested in looking at the story behind those important historic events. A really fascinating book. Available from Greaves and elsewhere as well, I'm sure, but we'll say a little bit more about that later on. It tells the story beginning in 1958 of Mikhail Goleniewski, who Tim will tell you more, but who became a double agent for the West and communicated, revealing not just secrets from behind the Iron Curtain, but also exposing corruption within the Allied ranks as well. It is the secret history of Agent Sniper, the spy the West deliberately left out in the cold. So without any further ado, I will hand you over with a very warm welcome to Tim.
Hello. Thank you very much, Nolan, and it's great to be part of Berwick Literary Festival again. And a big thank you to the organisers for making this happen, and above all for helping me navigate the technology for this Zoom session. Fingers crossed I don't mess this up. And thank you also to all of you for coming out today or coming here today to discuss the most important and yet most mysterious spy of the Cold War, Michal Goleniewski, a man who was often simultaneously a courageous undercover agent and a hunted defector, a bigamist and a bogus pretender to the Russian imperial throne, but who was, above all else, the best spy the West ever had and then lost. Now, Goleniewski is a name that I suspect may be new or at best only faintly familiar to many of you, and there's a reason for that. Because although Mikhail Goleniewski was once the most devastatingly effective Soviet bloc agent working covertly for British and American intelligence, he has been largely erased from the history books. And his courageous work on behalf of Western democracy has been essentially and deliberately airbrushed from the story of the Cold War. The mystery of how and why that happened is just one of the many and very tangled strands of Goleniewski's extraordinary story. Unpicking those strands and understanding that story has taken many years, and it required me to unearth long forgotten, or in many cases, long suppressed files held by intelligence services in Britain, America, and Poland. as well as scores of other documents stored in government and academic archives across Europe and the United States. And it also involved tracking down Goleniewski's own voluminous writings, his affidavits and his correspondence. Often, working on those documents, and there were many thousands of pages of them, it felt like I was trying to complete a vastly complex jigsaw puzzle without the picture on the front of the box for guidance. But when all of the pieces, or almost all of the pieces, came together, a very clear picture emerged. And that picture was of a remarkably brave and dedicated spy who for almost 3 years risked his life on behalf of the West as an agent in place behind the Iron Curtain before defecting to the United States with a huge treasure trove of top secret Soviet bloc documents and microfilms. In total, this is according to the CIA's own internal records, Goleniewski handed over to the United States hundreds of pages of Moscow's most vital military secrets, and even more importantly, he exposed 1,693 communist bloc spies, a haul which was unprecedented then and has never been equaled since. Now, those spies weren't minnows in the murky pool of Cold War intelligence gathering. Goleniewski's information led to the capture of some of the most serious espionage agents and organized spy rings operating undercover in Britain, Europe, and the United States throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Little wonder then that in the mid-1960s, the CIA recorded its admiration for Goleniewski's unparalleled contribution to Western intelligence. But as I assembled those same jigsaw pieces, another, more tragic picture of Mikhail Goleniewski emerged. And that picture was of a deeply flawed human being who, partly through his own failings, but primarily due to the actions of the CIA, was ultimately driven insane. In 1973, less than 10 years after praising his bravery and the accuracy of his intelligence, an internal CIA memo denounced Goleniewski as a real nut, absolutely nutty, and advised the US Secret Service to monitor his movements. How did Michal Goleniewski go from being the best spy and the most valuable defector the West ever had to such a crazed and dangerous threat? To understand that, we need to go back 60 years to the cold and dangerous streets of divided Berlin one dark evening in January 1961. At 5 p.m. on Wednesday, the 4th of January, 1961, an agent on surveillance duty for the East German secret police, the Stasi, spotted a man and a woman emerging from the communal entrance to an apartment block on Wollinerstrasse in East Berlin. The man was in his early 40s. He was tall and powerfully built with a distinctive cavalry-style moustache. The woman was slight and pretty, a brunette, and clearly a little younger than her companion. Berlin was then the epicenter of Cold War espionage. So many spies roamed the streets, fighting, sometimes physically, for control of the strategic city, that it had earned a derogatory German nickname. Berlin was the Agentensumpf, the swamp of spies. But although the city was divided into 4 sectors, each controlled by one of the 4 wartime allies, Soviet Union, United States, Britain, and France, in January 1961, the borders between the zones were not physical. The Berlin Wall would not be erected for another 6 months, and until then only a warning notice marked the edge of Russian-controlled East Berlin from the western sectors. Wollinerstrasse was no more than 150 meters from the American zone, and the Stasi agent watched as the man and the woman, each carrying only one small bag, hurried from the apartment block towards the border. At exactly the same time, the US consulate on Clayallee in West Berlin was on high alert. It was awaiting the arrival of a vitally important defector. Security staff and armed guards ringed the compound. They were all too aware that the Stasi and its Soviet intelligence counterparts had a well-earned reputation for kidnapping defectors or attempting to impede access to the safety of American territory. At 6 p.m., a West Berlin taxi pulled up outside the consulate gates. The man and the woman from the Wollinerstrasse apartment climbed out, and they were immediately brushed inside by the waiting Americans. What's remarkable is that at this point, neither this American reception committee nor the defector knew who they were dealing with. For the past 33 months, the defector had sent a treasure trove of Soviet bloc intelligence and military secrets to the West, but he had done so anonymously. All that the Americans who received his reports had known was his self-chosen cover name, Heckenschütz, the German word meaning sniper. Nor did they have any idea who the mysterious brunette with him might be. Sniper had never mentioned her in any of his reports. For his part, Sniper believed that he had been dealing with the FBI. In fact, that had been the first and most important condition he'd insisted on when he first offered to spy for the United States back in April 1958. And he did so for the very good reason that, as he had warned at that point, all other government departments, American government departments or agencies, and especially the CIA, had been penetrated by KGB moles. That evening in January 1961, Sniper had no way of knowing that the FBI had never received any of his reports. From day one, his letters had been intercepted by the CIA, which had run Sniper as an undercover agent in place, the most dangerous of all espionage roles, under entirely false pretenses. Inside the US consulate, Sniper gave his American interrogators his identity papers. These showed his real name, rank, and nationality. He was Michal Goleniewski, a lieutenant colonel in the Polish intelligence service, and he simultaneously worked for the Soviet KGB as its point man in Warsaw. I apologize for the poor quality of this image. It's the best surviving version of Goleniewski's Polish intelligence service ID card. His companion turned out to be his mistress, an East German school secretary called Irmgard Kampf. Goleniewski demanded and was granted asylum for both of them in the United States. For its part, the CIA was initially at least rather less honest. For the first few days of Goleniewski's debriefing, its officers continued to pretend that they worked for the FBI. Only as they prepared to fly Goleniewski and Kampf out of Germany to the United States did they admit that they were in fact CIA. It was a deception which put Goleniewski in a very difficult position. He knew the CIA was penetrated, and therefore he would be placing his life in the hands of an agency he could not fully trust. But it was now too late to back out. His masters in Polish intelligence were searching for him. And if he returned to their clutches, the best he could hope for was a swift bullet to the back of the head. Ultimately, he realized he had no choice but to trust the CIA. And for some time, that trust seemed to be justified. The CIA first put Goleniewski and Kampf up in a safe house outside McLean, Virginia. Then it helped them to rent an apartment in nearby Arlington. The agency gave Goleniewski a monthly stipend of $750. That's equivalent to around $6,500 today. Excuse me. And they also gave him an ex gratia lump sum of $24,000 to cover the 33 months he'd worked as an agent in place behind the Iron Curtain. That was worth, in today's money, a very generous $214,000. But that was only the first installment on what the CIA promised. Once it had finished his initial debriefings and was satisfied with his bona fides, that he was who and what he claimed to be, Goleniewski was to be given a full-time employment contract at $1,000 a month, $8,000 today, as well as health insurance and a restitution payment to compensate him and Kampf for the possessions, pension, and security they'd left behind in Poland and East Germany, respectively. At today's rate, that restitution payment would be valued at $1.6 million. And it wasn't just money. The CIA also sponsored Goleniewski's wedding to Kampf, a bigamous marriage as it turned out, since he was still married to his wife in Poland, whom he had abandoned with their 3 children. And it provided false papers to support his application for the marriage license from the state of Virginia. These were made out in his new and entirely fictitious American cover name, Franz Oldenburg. The agency also began arranging for the US Congress to pass a private bill, a personally tailored law, if you like, which would bypass American immigration regulations and grant Goleniewski the right to apply for US citizenship. That bill, HR 5507, was glowing in its praise for Goleniewski. It recorded that he was employed as a consultant by the US government. It celebrated his contributions to the security of the United States as truly significant, and said Goleniewski has collaborated with the government in an outstanding manner and under circumstances which have involved grave personal risk. That bill, HR 5507, reflected accurately the importance of Goleniewski to the United States and its Western allies like Britain in the Cold War. In the 33 months he'd worked as a volunteer agent in place, he had smuggled several hundred pages of top secret documents and several hundred more frames of Minox microfilms out from behind the Iron Curtain, covertly depositing them in CIA dead letter boxes. One was here in the gents' toilet of Berlin Zoo's railway station. When he defected, he brought yet more material, and he also directed the CIA to a tree in a Warsaw Park where he stashed a further tranche of microfilms, and the CIA successfully retrieved them. Then, after he arrived in the United States, he continued to disgorge Soviet bloc secrets retrieved from what the CIA admiringly called his exceptional memory. In total, and this is according to that internal CIA assessment of Goleniewski's revelations and value, which I prized eventually from the agency, In total, he exposed that 1,693 Soviet bloc officers and agents, many of whom had been spying under deep cover inside Western governments and intelligence services for decades. And he also provided details of the covert operations they were involved in. We'll come to some of the major spy rings and operations he exposed in just a moment. But first, I think it's important to put Goleniewski and his revelations into a little context. One of the great fears dominating the Cold War, at least from this side of the Iron Curtain, was the missile gap. The overwhelming, and as it turns out, quite incorrect, belief that the Soviet Union held a dangerous superiority in the number and power of intercontinental ballistic missiles. What is much less discussed, and yet was very much more real, was the intelligence gap. Throughout the 1950s, and this is according to the CIA's own internal documents and US government assessments, the United States had little, if any, reliable information on what Moscow was up to, nor, for the record, was Britain in any better shape. A succession of CIA covert operations and joint operations with MI6 in Warsaw Pact countries failed dramatically. Whereas by contrast, the KGB and its satellite intelligence services in other Soviet bloc countries were frequently able to exploit American and British incompetence and to harvest a rich yield of both intelligence and Western currency, as well as military hardware. As US government analyses rather ruefully admitted, Moscow was an old and very experienced hand at the spying game, whereas the United States was a very green newcomer to the table. One of the biggest problems was the lack of what today we would call human intelligence, and especially the dearth of valuable defectors. So then, at that point, the CIA was desperate for a good and high-ranking source of information, and the sniper letters, which Goleniewski sent from April 1958, and then the information he divulged as a defector from January 1961 onwards, were absolutely what it and its allies desperately needed. And Goleniewski delivered. To run through the major spy rings which his information exposed, and bear in mind, these are just the ones we know about. I discovered an MI5 letter of appreciation, which made clear there were many others which had not been publicly acknowledged. Those cases, the ones we know about, are some of the most serious and damaging espionage scandals of the Cold War. There was Colonel Stig Wennerström, a senior Swedish Air Force officer who sold British, US and NATO military secrets to Soviet military intelligence for decades. There was Heinz Felf, the head of counterintelligence in West Germany's foreign intelligence agency, the BND. He'd been a Soviet mole for more than 10 years, handing over not just West Germany's most sensitive information, but the cover names and true identities of scores of CIA staff, officers and agents both, with which Washington had trusted him. And there was Israel Beer, one of the closest advisors and confidants of Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. He was a Soviet mole who burrowed into the Israeli Defense Force and the heart of government and passed their secrets to Moscow for at least a decade. And here in Britain, we have Goleniewski to thank for the arrest and conviction of the Portland spy ring, Harry Horton and Bunty G. That's an MI5 surveillance photo of the pair. They were a pair of domestic traitors who sold some of the Admiralty's most important weapon secrets to Moscow, and who were run by 3 previously unknown KGB illegals, all of whom were living here under false identities. They were Gordon Lonsdale, aka Conan Molody, Peter and Helen Kroger, alias Morris and Lorna Cohen. And a capture of the Krogers, or the Cohens, would also lead, according to the then head of the CIA, to the exposure of another British naval traitor, John Vassell, the Admiralty employee who'd been caught and blackmailed in a Soviet gay honey trap. So chalk another success up to Goleniewski's account. But the biggest of all was George Blake, Moscow's man inside MI6, whose treachery sent scores of British agents to their death, as well as betraying one of the biggest Cold War operations ever mounted by American and British intelligence, the Berlin Tunnel, the strategically vital and hugely expensive operation to tap into Soviet bloc telephone and intelligence traffic. Blake betrayed that from its inception, meaning that everything the West thought we gained from it was meaningless at best, bogus at worst. According to the CIA's internal reports on Blake, and as we'll see, there's a very strange absence of equivalent British material, it was Goleniewski who first fingered Blake. And it was his information which proved decisive in breaking Blake after 3 days of otherwise unsuccessful interrogation. It's little wonder then that the MI5 letter of appreciation I unearthed recorded Britain's gratitude, praising the inestimable value of Goleniewski's information and leads. And if the security service budget didn't run to the substantial rewards showered on him by the CIA, we did send Goleniewski an antique George III silver tankard by way of a thank you present. It's little wonder either that on the other side of the Iron Curtain, Soviet bloc intelligence was equally, though rather less happily, impressed. I got hold of Goleniewski's file maintained by his primary employers, the Polish intelligence service. This is its cover, and it shows his codename, Teletechnik. The file contains more than 1,100 pages of remarkably revealing documents. Among them were the records of his trial in a Polish military court in secret and in absentia for treason. The trial papers showed that Goleniewski had set Warsaw's espionage efforts and those of its ultimate masters in Moscow back at least 5 years. And, like a mirror image of George Blake, Goleniewski had caused the arrest of scores of communist agents. In April 1961, that court duly sentenced Goleniewski to death. But by this time, Goleniewski was tucked away in the United States, living under a cover identity, or rather a series of cover identities in CIA safe houses. He ended up in this apartment block on 82nd Avenue in Queens, New York. For more than 2 years after his defection, the agency and MI5 regularly debriefed him there, continually adding yet more valuable intelligence information to their files. More pertinently, they added names to those files. Between 1961 and the end of 1963, Goleniewski identified or gave leads to enable the identification of dozens of Soviet bloc spies inside European governments and intelligence services, including MI5, the US State Department, and the CIA itself. And then it all fell apart. In mid-1963, the CIA began covertly and off the record, briefing US lawmakers and friendly journalists that Goleniewski had lost his mind. Its star defector, the agency claimed, had gone mad. Later, and the key word here is later, the agency would justify this assessment by pointing to Goleniewski's grandiose and entirely fraudulent claims to be Tsarevich Alexei Romanov, son of the last Tsar of Imperial Russia, who had, so he claimed, miraculously survived or escaped from the assassination of the entire Russian royal family in Siberia in 1918. It was an absurd pretense. But since, at that point, the Romanov corpses had yet to be discovered, it was one which attracted an enormous amount of rather excitable press coverage, both in America and internationally. But there are a number of problems with the CIA's timeline. Most fundamentally, the facts, as laid out in the CIA's own documents, as well as congressional records and Goleniewski's own writings, simply don't fit. If the devil is always in the detail, in this case, it's the calendar which shows up the lie. One of the documents I obtained from the CIA after an extended Freedom of Information Act tussle was its internal assessment of Goleniewski's contribution to American national security. And this contains a revealing and unequivocal statement on the timeline of his descent into madness. Here's what it says. It is important to note that until approximately early 1964, Goleniewski was an accurate and reliable source of intelligence. Early 1964. That endorsement is completely at odds with the CIA's covert briefings from the middle of the previous year that Goleniewski had completely lost his mind. Plainly, both could not be correct. So I went back to all the other documentation and pieced together my own timeline of events and incidents from the summer of 1963 to the summer of 1964. And that told a very interesting story. The first thing to say is that Goleniewski first went public with his bogus Romanov pretense in May 1964. But his troubles with the CIA began almost a year earlier. In the summer of 1963, the CIA began slow-walking investigations into the intelligence that Goleniewski provided. Then it reneged on its commitment to pay and employ him. Only an intervention by the Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy forced the agency to live up to its promises, and then only temporarily. The CIA also began harassing him, and there's no other way to put this. It started to play mind games. It switched repeatedly the cover identities he was assigned, and it ensured that the documentation which formally regularized his presence in the United States, his alien registration card, was in a different name to that set out on HR 5507. And that made it impossible for him to apply for the US citizenship he'd been promised. On top of that, it plainly obstructed attempts by lawmakers on Capitol Hill to get Goleniewski to testify before powerful Senate committees. Then, on New Year's Eve 1963, the CIA reclaimed the handgun it had given Goleniewski for protection, and it instructed the New York police to rescind his gun license. It's worth noting that the CIA did this at the same time as Polish intelligence service agents in America were searching for Goleniewski with the intention of carrying out the death sentence imposed by the military court in Warsaw. Days after that, the CIA formally suspended Goleniewski, placing him on what it termed leave without pay, a status that lasted until it finally and formally sacked him. From January 1964 onwards, it would never pay him the salary it had promised, nor would it allow him access to health insurance coverage. And since both he and Irmgard became seriously ill that winter, she needed hospitalization and breast tumor surgery, Goleniewski was left to shoulder these substantial medical costs himself. In short, the CIA cast the best Cold War spy it had ever had out into the cold. And all of this, obviously, begs the question, why? What was the CIA up to? Why had it turned against its star intelligence asset? And once again, my timeline threw up the answer in the form of two names, which, if you have an interest in Cold War intelligence, may be familiar. A rival defector named Anatoly Golitsyn and his malign alliance with the CIA's head of counterintelligence, James Jesus Angleton. Golitsyn was a mid-level KGB officer. He defected in December 1961, 10 months after Goleniewski, and in stark contrast to the treasure trove of material that Goleniewski delivered, Golitsyn arrived bearing only a handful of documents, none of which, according to an internal CIA account of the saga, contained anything useful, and nor did this ever change. Despite this, Golitsyn insisted that he, and only he, was the only genuine defector to come to the United States. All others who went before him, or even those who came after him, so he said, would be fakes. In spy speak, they would be dangles or provocations, cunning deceptions dispatched by the KGB to mislead American intelligence with false information. There was no evidence to back this claim up, and many of the CIA Soviet division officers who were assigned to his case believed that Golitsyn was either a liar or mentally unbalanced. By contrast, Angleton and his disciples in the rival counterintelligence staff swallowed Golitsyn's allegations lock, stock, and barrel. But for the first 18 months after Golitsyn defected, Angleton and his team did not have control over the Golitsyn case. The date on which that changed is significant. Summer 1963. From that point onwards, Angleton handled Golitsyn exclusively. Golitsyn demanded and was given access to the CIA's top secret defector files. Goleniewski's was one of them. Inevitably, Golitsyn denounced Goleniewski as bogus, a misinformation agent, he said, dispatched by Moscow. Despite Goleniewski's unparalleled record of success, Angleton, who had never accepted Goleniewski's bona fides anyway, bought Golitsyn's evidence-free allegations, and the CIA harassment and mistreatment of Goleniewski swiftly followed. It would, in time, be the driving force in tipping Goleniewski over the edge into genuine insanity. But we can't ignore Goleniewski's own responsibility, his fraudulent pretense to be the heir to the Russian imperial throne. We know now this to have been completely bogus. DNA tests on remains recovered in the late 1990s and early 2000s from Siberia have proved beyond any doubt that they belong to and account for all the immediate Romanov family, son Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children, including the Tsarevich Alexei. So why did Goleniewski claim to be Alexei Romanov? Was this, as the CIA tried to insinuate, evidence that the man had lost his mind? No, not at first. Going through Goleniewski's early and internationally published claims on radio and in press interviews, what emerges is a very different motive: greed. Pure opportunist greed. There was, at the time, and had been for many decades, a widespread belief that prior to the revolution, the Tsar had smuggled a vast fortune out of Russia to banks in Europe and the United States. When Goleniewski first came out as Alexei, the estimate for this fortune was between $200 and $400 million. That's well over $1 billion in today's money. And Goleniewski made plain that he wanted to get his hands on this supposed inheritance. And that, initially at least, was the motive. But over the following months, he dug himself ever deeper into the Romanov hole he'd created. In September 1964, he got married again, and still bigamously, to Irmgard Kampf, this time in New York. But this time, the wedding was officiated by the most senior priest of the Russian Orthodox Church in exile, the most senior figure in the religion. And the groom's name on the New York marriage license and in the parish register, well, that was Alexei Romanov, son of Nicholas and Alexandra Romanov of Russia. Hours after that ceremony, Irmgard gave birth to the couple's daughter. Goleniewski duly registered the birth under her imperial name, Tatiana Romanov. From that moment onwards, Goleniewski was trapped irrevocably in his pretense. And since he had gone public with it, he'd handed to Angleton and the CIA the ammunition with which to destroy his reputation. An effort, ironically, in which the agency was aided by a remarkable covert scheme by Polish intelligence. And as the years wore on, and as Goleniewski's financial position worsened, his mental state also deteriorated. And in the end, he came, from every document I found, to believe that he was Alexei Romanov. He went to his grave in 1993, still proclaiming himself to be the heir to the Russian throne and denouncing US and British intelligence for keeping him from his inheritance. Now, I've been droning on for quite some time and I want to leave time for any questions, but before I wrap up, why does any of this matter today? 60 years after Goleniewski defected, is his story any more than an extraordinary piece of Cold War history? The story of a brave and vitally important, but profoundly flawed old spy? I think it still matters, and that's for 3 reasons. The first is the chaos caused by Angleton and Golitsyn. This didn't just ruin Goleniewski, it tore apart both the CIA and MI5. Both services were directed down a rabbit hole, searching for imaginary traitors in their respective midsts who Golitsyn claimed to know about. The CIA's own internal accounts of this sorry saga record that mole hunts devastated US intelligence, blinded it, in fact, and severely hobbled its ability to protect America. Dozens of officers came under suspicion, including, ironically, Angleton himself. And the same havoc hit MI5. It, too, searched fruitlessly for Golitsyn's alleged moles, leading at one point to a highly destabilizing investigation into the former Director General, Sir Roger Hollis. And as with the CIA in the United States, MI5's ability to defend the realm, that's its formal job title, was seriously undermined. The CIA has, thanks to America's Freedom of Information Act, released or been forced to release much of the details of this fiasco. Britain's Freedom of Information Act is a rather less effective corrective to official secrecy. Unlike the US, here MI5 and MI6 are specifically excluded from FOI requests. And so we have none of their documents on the British mole hunting, nor on investigations into George Blake, amongst others. In fairness, MI5 does voluntarily release some files after 50 years, including the Portland spy ring files we talked about. But although MI5 confirmed to me in writing that it still holds a full file on Michal Goleniewski, it declined to release that file because, in its own words, of the continuing sensitivity of the material contained within it. What, 60 years after his defection and 3 decades after the collapse of the communist bloc, could this sensitivity possibly be? That brings us to the second reason why I think Goleniewski's Tangled saga matters today. Long before Golitsyn's evidence-free claims, Goleniewski warned MI5 that it had a mole, a middle-ranking agent, he said, in its midst. Because Golitsyn diverted MI5's mole hunters down a different and false path, the security service never investigated who this traitor might be. He has never been identified. And that, I think, does matter rather a lot. But the final reason is even more current. One of Goleniewski's earliest and most emphatically repeated warnings was the existence of a KGB disinformation unit, a specialist team whose job was to sow doubt and chaos in the West with false stories and bogus intelligence. The KGB ceased to exist after the collapse of Soviet communism, but neither it nor its methods have gone away. Its successor, the FSB, is in many ways a rebranded KGB, and it deploys the same old KGB disinformation techniques, notably during the 2016 US presidential election and allegedly in the Brexit referendum here. Russia may now use the internet and so-called troll farms, but the techniques and the intentions haven't changed. We simply haven't learnt the lessons that Goleniewski warned us we needed to. Right, that I think is where we should stop. So over to you on what I hope will be your questions.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was we've had some questions and comments flooding in as you've been speaking there, and I'm sure there'll be more coming. In fact, there's a couple more popping up there now. But a really, really fascinating introduction to the story, but also to the book itself, which I'll just show you again there briefly. If I can pop to a couple of those questions. The first one comes from James Bruce, and it talks about the title, the way in which you describe Goleniewski. It's James asks, do you really think, are you saying he's more important than Klaus Fuchs or by Ursula Kościuszki, Red Sonja? Could a case be made for a figure like Marcus Wolf? In other words, is it right to describe him as the most important spy of the Cold War? Is he perhaps the most important spy in the service of the West?
Yeah, that's the simple answer. He was our most important spy of the early Cold War. Yes,
and I think that it made me think about the point when you talked about the real hunger for information. You know, the fact that there was this dearth of reliable and high quality information, and so it sounded as if his his appearance on the scene and his interactions were kind of transformative in that way. Suddenly they turned round the ability that the West had to be involved in espionage.
Yeah, I mean, the West hadn't had a particularly reliable defector for probably a decade before Goleniewski, and we were desperately short of really good intelligence. And yes, Goleniewski absolutely turned this round. I mean, you don't expose 1,693 Soviet bloc spies without that being transformative.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We've got another, it doesn't say who this is from.
Excuse me.
Starts by saying, what a fascinating story with compelling live narrative by Tim. Thank you very much. From all your research into espionage, what do you think are the most important psychological characteristics for a successful spy?
From what I've seen, and can I preface that by saying, I try and talk about this at the end of the book, I think we have a somewhat distorted view of spying and espionage. You know, it's the Bond effect, isn't it? You know, we kind of expect there to be svelte sirens and casinos and martinis. It isn't. It's a grubby, dangerous, pretty miserable business. Necessary, yes, but grubby and sordid and shabby. And what emerged very clearly from Goleniewski's story and from work I'd done for the previous book, Hitler's British Traitors, the spies who worked for Nazi Germany in Britain during the war, British spies, there is a very common theme which emerges, and that is the mental fraying which this spying imposes, if you like, or causes. You know, Goleniewski was a difficult character. His Polish intelligence service files are full. This is when he was working for them. They're full of praise for his ability. They're saying he was a bit arrogant and didn't really get on with his colleagues. But it's after he starts spying for the West that you can see the mental fabric begin to fray. And you can see this man, because he's living a double, sometimes triple life, you can see through these documents, particularly the Polish documents, you can see his life beginning to fray at the edges. And eventually, under the pressure that the CIA put on him particularly, it would completely tear him apart. There is a CIA internal assessment of defectors and of how to deal with defectors, and it recognizes this. This is actually a contemporary one. This is the manual that they used for Goleniewski, and it says, defectors are vulnerable. Play on it. Play on that psychological and physical vulnerability. And I think that's the characteristic which emerges most plainly.
That's fascinating, because of course initially it sounds quite comical, doesn't it? This idea that he began to believe his own fantasies when he made the claim in search of the czarist fortune, but actually someone existing in a context where everything's unstable, and as you say, you know, trying to play within his own mind, trying to play 2 or 3 identities off each other, you can see how it might happen.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, what we don't have time to sort of touch on it slightly, but the CIA constantly switched his cover identities. So, you know, at one point he doesn't know, is he Franz Roman Oldenburg? Is he Michal Goleniewski? Is he Martin Chirico? Who the hell he was? The CIA constantly changed that in the period in which they'd begun to break him. And identity from the CIA's own manual is something so crucial to defectors that it's a real Achilles heel.
Well, it becomes weaponized. Well, back to the questions. We've got a couple more here. Jerry Foley asks, how did he survive financially for all those years until his death? And then also a little bit about his legacy. Is his daughter still alive? Did you have any contact with her as part of the research?
Yeah, the daughter bit I'll come to in a moment. His financial position, it's curious. The big restitution payment, the one that's worth 1.6 million today, that was put into a trust and paid out to him at $500 a month. And they did keep paying that. That was kind of like a bond payment. Mm. And as far as I'm aware, that carried on, but that was the only thing that carried on. And he had some money, as we talked about, which enabled him at other times, and particularly towards in the latter stages of his delusion, he was reduced to appealing through deeply unpleasant right-wing organizations for support. I mean, it's pathetic in the literal meaning of the word. There is real pathos in this. His daughter, Tatiana Romanov. Yes, I did contact her. I tracked her down. She still lives in the States. She does not use the name Romanov or indeed Goleniewski, you'd be surprised to know, but she is findable, and I found her. And I wanted to speak to her about Goleniewski, the man. For me, espionage stories, spy stories, can feel a bit Boise from time to time. I was particularly interested in the man. You know, what was he like as a father? What was he like as a husband? And so that's what I wanted to ask Tatiana. And I wrote to her initially, and I got no reply. And I emailed her, and I got no reply. And so I went to the States for a final research trip, and I hand-delivered a letter to the receptionist at her apartment block, and I got no reply. And finally, it came to the point, push comes to shove, and I phoned her. I've been a journalist for more than 40 years, and I'm used to people putting the phone down on me or being reluctant to talk. I think this is one of the few occasions where, when I spoke to her very briefly, I was impressed. It was very plain that she was frightened. And she said, please don't contact me again. And that's when the phone went down. I wish she would talk.
It adds to that sense towards the end there of the continuing importance of this story, and perhaps the reasons why it's been still so well hidden.
It is curious.
Yeah, we have one final question which links nicely into your point about the kind of boys' own adventure nature of the spy story. Keith Robertson asks, how close to the reality of the period do you think that Le Carré came from the 1960s on, and he means specifically the sort of psychological makeup of spies?
I think pretty close. And don't forget, Le Carré had intelligence experience at the time. But I also think Angleton captures the grubbiness of the late 50s, early 1960s Cold War espionage battle, if that's what it was. I think he captures that beautifully and in really somber colors. So yes, Le Carré, but a hat tip to Angleton as well.
Yeah, good stuff. But of course, if you really want to get the real inside story of what it was all like, The Spy Who Was Left Out in the Cold is the book that you're looking for. Available at Greaves, but also available elsewhere as well. Tim, thank you ever so much for what has been a fascinating, engaging, and I think it's left us with as much of a sense of intrigue almost as the story itself. That idea about the legacy of it and seeing the seeds perhaps of current intrigue, fascinating as well.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and a big thank you to Berwick, and good luck with the rest of the festival. It's a terrific festival and great work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate those really kind words. We are, of course, a voluntary organisation. We're a charity. So if you have enjoyed the session and you feel such a desire, please do have a look at the closing slides. There are ways in which you can, if you want to donate in any way at all, that's always very, very welcome. There are many more events to follow, some of which will be in the closing credits, which are coming up very, very soon. I can see the links just gone up there on the website, on the chat as well, if you want to, if you did want to make a donation. So some fantastic events still to come. Former Prime Minister Gordon Brown at 2 o'clock, hotly anticipated, of course. But we're very grateful to you as an audience for being here for us. That's what it's all about. I do know, I can say that some of our events this year in Zoom have been really, we wouldn't have been able to actually host the capacity in our normal physical venue. So that's been really great to see as well. But we look forward, of course, to you enjoying the rest of this festival, but also we hope returning in October 2022. But my final thanks, of course, must go to Tim Tate for his fascinating and intriguing paper this afternoon. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.